And on the international front, NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has confirmed that members have started to increase their defense spending. Now, this, of course, is after U.S. President Donald Trump asked for more contributions from the Western Defense Alliance to ease the burden on U.S. taxpayers. Under a 2014 agreement, each member is required to boost military spending to about 2% of its GDP by 2024. But NATO diplomats say only two-thirds of the 28 allies, excluding the US, have a realistic plan to hit that level by then. America, of course, has spent about 3.57% of GDP on defense in 2017.
But of course, everywhere, we are speaking about our spendings, 2% of GDP. Latvia follow that, and we already reached 2% of GDP. But of course, I think it could be very useful for all NATO, that all NATO countries will reach these 2% of GDP, because it is necessary for our security in Europe, it is necessary for our security in the world.
Well, Elena Casas now joins us in Brussels with the latest on that meeting. Elena, welcome to the show. Now, it certainly is not a routine meeting this year, with, of course, Trump's comment on Germany shattering any illusions we had of solidarity between those NATO countries. Now, give us the key highlights from today's meeting.
Well, Donald Trump certainly started the day in a characteristically blunt style at a breakfast this morning with Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. He called other NATO countries delinquent for not spending a sufficient amount of money on their defence, and he repeated his frequent claim that the US is shouldering an unfair burden for Europe's defence, something that many European countries saying shows he doesn't really understand how NATO is financed. But of course, as you were saying, NATO countries are increasing their pledges to spend more on the military. Jens Stoltenberg congratulated Trump at that breakfast for giving the incentive for countries to spend more on their military. A further 8 countries say they will be reaching that 2% target by 2024. For Trump, though, apparently that's still not enough. He suggested at today's meeting that that target should be doubled to 4%, which would be an extraordinary amount of money. That would involve, for example, France spending the same amount of money on its military as Russia does, and no other ally was willing to sign up to that target. In the end, the meeting hasn't ended in as recriminatory a style as it perhaps could have done. Trump has signed up to a joint communique which restates the alliance's objectives in fairly consensual language, saying things like the countries remain committed to go to one another's aid. So he has signed up to that joint communique, unlike at the G7 summit in Canada a few months ago, but he certainly has caused a fairly tense tone to today's meetings.
Now, Elena, despite the progress we have seen, we know this year's meeting was certainly overshadowed by a global shift, where we're seeing the EU nations struggling with leadership issues. We're seeing new rhetoric from the US and Trump seeming to cozy up with Russia's Putin. How have all these issues influenced talks?
Well, on the Russia question, that's what leaders are talking about at a dinner that's going on at the moment, and what they will talk about tomorrow. There was language about Russia in the communique that they've all signed off on, which condemned Russia's hostile behaviour in Eastern Europe. It said that NATO continues to consider the annexation of Crimea in 2014 as illegal, and that it will continue to support Eastern European countries like Latvia and Lithuania, the Baltic states, who do believe themselves to be under genuine threat of a possible Russian invasion. And of course, NATO has sent troops and weaponry to Eastern European countries in recent years to try and help assuage that fear. For the Eastern European countries, though, it's one thing for Donald Trump to sign up to that language, agreeing to condemn Russia now. What they're concerned about is that after he's met Vladimir Putin in Helsinki on Monday, he may say exactly the opposite.
Now, Elena, some have questioned whether the NATO alliance can be preserved moving forward. Now, judging by the events at this year's meeting, is this idea far-fetched?
Well, as I say, Trump has been more conciliatory than he could have been. He has signed up to a communique which states that the alliance's general objectives. He hasn't said anything as dramatic as some of the things he said during his campaign when he called for the alliance to be scrapped and called it obsolete. He is still insisting that other countries need to contribute more cash to their own military spending, and he is still promoting the idea that America is shouldering an unfair burden. But he hasn't been quite as disruptive in the language that we've heard from him today as he perhaps could have been.
Well, many thanks, Elena, for that update from the ground. Of course, Elena Casas joining us there in Brussels.